How do you break the will of a soldier who thinks he's winning? In 1943, the U.S. military realized they didn't need interrogation or force, they just needed a film projector. When these 200 German prisoners at Camp Jerome saw what was playing at the cinema, some wept, some screamed propaganda, and others simply gave up. Because for the first time, they weren't looking at a movie. They were looking at the truth. What the prisoners expected was propaganda. Every soldier understood the formula. The Americans would show bombed-out Hamburg, the ruins of Cologne, footage calibrated to extinguish hope. What appeared on the screen instead was a woman in a sequined dress laughing beneath a chandelier. The music swelled, warm and enormous. The colors were deep reds and vivid yellows, richer than anything these men had seen on a screen in years. The world inside that film was untouched, abundant, completely, bafflingly at peace. And in the silence between the music and the shuffling of wooden chairs, something shifted quietly, permanently in the minds of the men watching. To understand what that projector light did to those prisoners, you have to understand the world that had built them. By the autumn of 1943, the war had already broken something essential inside Germany's self-image. The Sixth Army had been annihilated at Stalingrad in February, a catastrophe so complete that the Reich had declared 4 days of national mourning. The Afrika Korps had surrendered in Tunisia in May, taking with it over 250,000 experienced Axis troops. The empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow was now contracting slowly, like a lung emptying of air. Inside Germany, rationing had stripped civilian life to its bones. Butter, meat, and real coffee had been replaced by substitutes with different names and the same gray, exhausted taste. Women stood in lines for bread that grew shorter in supply and longer in queue. The Reich called it total war. Every comfort, every private ambition, every small pleasure was surrendered to the machine. The men captured in Tunisia had enlisted when Germany still believed in its own invincibility. They had crossed the Mediterranean believing in a version of the world carefully constructed over years of newsreels, radio broadcasts, and approved texts. America was spiritually bankrupt, they had been told, a mongrel nation without discipline or iron character, a country incapable of sustaining the demands of a serious war. The propaganda had been relentless and precise. It had been absorbed not as explicit belief, but as atmospheric truth, the frequency beneath everything, too low to hear and impossible to argue against. Then Arkansas arrived, and Arkansas did not match the frequency at all. If this story moves something inside you, hit the like button and subscribe right now. These men witnessed something the history books barely acknowledge, and their story deserves to be told in full. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Every single one gets read. Camp Jerome sat in the flat delta farmland of southeastern Arkansas, 30 miles from the Mississippi River. It was one of more than 500 prisoner-of-war camps the United States operated on its own soil during the war. At its peak, the American POW system held over 400,000 Axis prisoners, more men than the entire pre-war population of cities like Frankfurt or Leipzig. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be fed and housed to the standards of the detaining nation's own soldiers. The Americans interpreted this requirement with a generosity that left men genuinely stunned. 3 meals a day arrived in the mess halls. Roast beef, white bread without ration cards, real coffee, not the gray grain substitute that had replaced it in German kitchens years earlier. Cigarettes were distributed, medical care was provided, and in documented cases it exceeded what many prisoners had received inside the Wehrmacht itself. One prisoner reportedly pushed his tray away on the first morning and told the man next to him that the Americans were trying to humiliate them with abundance. His bunkmate told him to stop talking and eat. The humiliation, whatever it was, did not stop. The Army called it recreational programming, and the logic was entirely pragmatic. Idle, bitter prisoners caused disruption. Fed, occupied, moderately comfortable prisoners did not. So Jerome offered baseball and volleyball, a German language library, workshops, and twice a week in the main assembly hall, Cinema Night. The films were not selected for any strategic purpose. They were simply what the Army had and what the distribution networks kept sending. Hollywood productions, current ones, films with Fred Astaire on a mirrored ballroom floor with Judy Garland beneath perfect studio light. Films where orchestras swelled and the actors moved through worlds that knew nothing about dying. The prisoners arrived for the first screening with their suspicion intact. They filed into rows of folding wooden chairs in a room that smelled of something none of them could identify. Something warm and slightly sweet and utterly unfamiliar. American guards stood at the rear, relaxed, holding cups of something cold and carbonated, talking quietly among themselves. The room dimmed, the projector hummed, and the screen filled with color. The first reaction, documented in reports compiled by the Army's Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, was disbelief. The food on the restaurant tables in the films had to be props. The automobiles had to be borrowed. The apartments were sets. The abundance was fabricated specifically for the camera and dismantled the moment filming stopped. This was the only explanation that fit. Because the alternative, that the world on that screen was simply ordinary, that it reflected the daily life of a country currently at war with Germany, was an explanation with consequences too large to absorb all at once. Then the guards started talking, not to persuade, not to lecture. The way bored men talk on long, quiet nights, they mentioned things. Drive-ins they had visited before their draft notices arrived. Diners with pie on every counter. Saturday matinees that cost 25 cents and ran all afternoon. They named prices and described meals and talked about places the way men talk about home, when home is very far away and the talking is the only way to touch it. They were not attempting to demoralize their prisoners. They were simply filling silence. But every casual sentence landed in the dark like a stone dropped into still water, and the ring spread outward in directions no one planned. The numbers, had anyone been in a position to read them clearly at the time, told the same story with less subtlety. In 1943, the United States produced 89 million tons of steel. Germany, at absolute industrial capacity and drawing on occupied territories, produced 34 million. American oil output exceeded 1.2 billion barrels that year. Germany's total, including synthetic fuel produced at enormous cost from coal, reached approximately 55 million. For every tank Germany built in 1944, the United States produced roughly 4. But a statistic on a radio bulletin exists at a distance. It can be explained away, contextualized, dismissed. A man in a white tuxedo dancing across a polished floor under a chandelier that blazed with electric light that was real in a way that statistics had no power to touch. The popcorn was what broke them, not the aircraft carriers being launched from American shipyards at a pace Germany's entire navy could not equal, not the merchant convoys crossing the Atlantic loaded with ammunition and fuel. The popcorn. In post-war interviews conducted over the following decades, prisoner after prisoner returned to this single detail. The guards brought food into the cinema not because the night was special, not because it was a celebration, not because someone had ordered a softening gesture. They brought it because it was Tuesday and there was a film on, and popcorn was what you ate at a film. One former prisoner described a guard tearing open a bag of peanuts and offering some across the aisle, not as reconciliation, not as a deliberate act of anything, simply because he had extra, and sharing seemed like the natural thing to do. That unconscious, unremarkable generosity landed like a quiet verdict being read aloud in a language no one had to translate. The spring of 1944 brought a change in the screenings that the camp's administrators noted in internal reports with careful, bureaucratic understatement. The films were producing an effect, not a simple one. Some prisoners responded with anger. They called the Hollywood films the most sophisticated propaganda they had ever encountered, precisely because the scenes were invisible. A newsreel could be argued against. An authority figure telling you what to conclude could be resented. But a musical comedy about misunderstandings and reunions simply existed on the screen, offering nothing to push against, nothing to dismiss. Others went quiet, a different kind of quiet from rage, the quiet that arrives when something fundamental revises itself inside a man and he hasn't yet decided what to place in the space where the old certainty lived. News seeped into Camp Jerome through Red Cross bulletins, careful half-sentences from guards who weren't supposed to discuss the war but sometimes did, and the hollow eyes of new arrivals men captured in Italy and France, and the Rhineland, who described cities that no longer looked like cities, streets reduced to frameworks, buildings standing as outlines against orange skies. Each new face that appeared inside the wire carried information that no official communication would confirm, but that the arithmetic of defeat made unmistakable. The July assassination plot against Hitler had failed. Rommel was dead. The Western Front was fragmenting under the weight of Allied pressure that Germany's exhausted reserve could not match. One prisoner, his account aligns precisely with documented records from Jerome, described watching a film that winter with the methodical attention of a soldier studying a map. He had begun watching the backgrounds, not the actors, not the plot. The street scenes glimpsed through taxi windows, the storefronts, the civilians carrying groceries into apartment buildings, children on bicycles in wide suburban streets, waitresses delivering plates of food that could have fed a German family for 3 days. He was searching for the lie in the background. He was not finding it. A letter arrived from his mother in December 1944. It had taken 3 months to reach him, rerouted and censored twice. She wrote in the careful, measured language of a woman who understood that every word was being read by someone who was not the intended recipient. Between the neutral sentences, in the deliberate vagueness about his younger brother's whereabouts and what the evening sounded like now, and how the apartment sat in silence, he read something she had not written. He folded the letter, held it against his chest, sat in the barracks for a long time without moving. That evening was a cinema night. He almost did not go. Then he went. The film was a broad American comedy, warm, misunderstandings building toward reunions, every knot of conflict dissolved beneath a clear and cloudless sky in the final reel. The kind of ending that felt, to a man raised on German romantic tragedy, almost offensively uncomplicated. He watched every frame. Near the end, a minor scene unfolded in a grocery store, 30 seconds at most. A character moved through aisles of stacked tins and fresh vegetables, chose something almost at random, and dropped it into a basket without looking back. The director had given the scene no weight. It existed purely to move the character from one room to another. He stared at those shelves. He thought about the cues his mother had described in the careful silence between her sentences. The ersatz coffee, the ration cards worn thin from handling, the way German newsreels had spent years explaining that American civilians were suffering under the chaos of a leaderless, undisciplined country. He thought about how thoroughly, how confidently, how completely he had been told the wrong thing. The film ended. The lights came up. He did not weep. He was past weeping. What settled in him was quieter than grief and more permanent. The specific, irreversible understanding of a man who has seen in his bones, not in argument, not in evidence assembled for debate, but in his bones, that the outcome was never genuinely in question. He walked back to the barracks through the cold Arkansas night. The stars above the delta were brilliant and indifferent. The perimeter wire caught the watchtower light. A guard somewhere nearby was humming something low and tuneless. It might have been the song from the film. The Special Projects Division's reports from early 1945 noted a measurable shift across camps throughout the South and Midwest. Prisoners were showing increased cooperative behavior, reduced resistance to reorientation programming. The bureaucratic language was describing something the bureaucracy had no precise vocabulary for, not military capitulation that was already complete. This was deeper. The slow internal surrender of men who had spent their entire adult lives inside one picture of the world and had now, against their will and without any single decisive argument to resist, been shown another. More than 400,000 Axis prisoners passed through the American system before the war ended. The formal re-education programs the Army ran produced results historians still debate. Some succeeded in shifting perspectives. Some produced only resentment. But the cinema did something the programs could not always do. It showed rather than told. It offered no argument to refute, no authority to resist, no message visible enough to reject. It placed a world on a screen and let men look at it. And the looking did its slow, patient work in the dark, the way light works on a photograph left too long in the open air. He was repatriated to Germany in 1946. He arrived in a country that looked like the newsreel footage he had once expected to see that first night in Arkansas, the ruins of Frankfurt, the rubble of the Rhineland, the hollow architecture of a civilization that had consumed itself from the inside out. He found his mother alive. His younger brother had not survived the war's final weeks. He did not speak much about America in the years that followed. The camps existed in an uncomfortable space, too comfortable for the bitterness that defeat required, too foreign to fit cleanly into the story of suffering that post-war Germany was building for itself. But decades later, in an interview recorded when he was an old man and the war had finally acquired the distance required to say certain things clearly, he described those cinema nights with quiet, unexpected precision. He remembered the color of the projector light cutting through the dark. He remembered the smell he could not name on the first night, warm, slightly sweet, completely unfamiliar, and how long it took him to understand that it was simply something ordinary people ate when they went to the pictures. He remembered a guard offering something across the aisle without ceremony, because he had extra and the gesture seemed natural. And he remembered the specific quality of the silence between the film ending and the lights coming back up. The few seconds where the screen went dark and the room held its breath, and everything that had been true before the projector clicked on was no longer exactly true anymore. He said it simply, the way men say things that have had 30 years to find their final shape. The lights came up, he said, and everything was different. Not outside, inside. And that was the only difference that ever mattered. Camp Jerome closed in 1946. The flat Arkansas farmland absorbed it slowly. The barracks came down. The wire came down. The assembly hall where the projector had hummed twice a week was demolished, its lumber dispersed into other buildings and other lives. Almost nothing physical remains of the place where 200 men sat in folding wooden chairs and watched a woman in a sequined dress, laugh beneath a chandelier, and felt the world they had been given crack quietly open. But the story of what happened in those dark rooms of men who arrived carrying one version of the world and sat in the shifting light of another and felt the distance between the two close around them, like a verdict that story needs no building to survive. Truth does not always arrive as an argument. It does not always come through force or confrontation or evidence carefully assembled under bright lights. Sometimes it arrives as a song, as a stranger offering something from an open bag across a darkened aisle, as an ordinary grocery store glimpsed for 30 seconds in the background of a scene that no one thought was important, as the lights going down and the slow, irreversible understanding that somewhere between what you were told and what you were seeing, something had gone profoundly and permanently wrong. The popcorn was still warm. The war was already over.